attention, please. We are especially fortunate this morning to have with us Andrija Puharich, who is just, I think the simplest way of saying it is to say that he's just an all-around genius. He's done psychic research. He has studied the Brazilian healer Origo in a first-hand kind of way. His book, Beyond Telepathy, has achieved some acclaim, wide acclaim. Andrija is an inventor with 61 patents to his name. He's a technical consultant to the Canadian government, and he is the editor of the Iceland Papers, which is a compilation of research papers on paraphysics. So let's welcome Andrija Puharich.
In my review, can everybody hear? There's no mic. In my review of the phenomenon of touch stroking, I include as real the following information-action cycle of effects. 1, the normally light-activated photograph of a person, said photo subsequently being used in touch stroking to collect information about that person. 2, the paranormal activation of a photograph which is enclosed within a light-tight metal box, said photo subsequently being used in touch stroking to collect information with respect to the image thereon. 3, touch stroking of metal which results in metal softening, bending, breaking, or even at times dematerialization. 4, medical applications of these 3 effects in diagnosis or therapy in a biological context where appropriate. These studies were carried out over a number of years with Eileen Garrett, Peter Herkus, Francis Farrelly, Arrigo Pachita, a healer in Mexico, and Uri Geller as psychics, who used their touch stroking ability to obtain the paranormal effects. The hearing studies were carried out on a sample of some 1,000 hearing impaired humans. The biological studies were carried out on some hundreds of sheep, dogs, cats, and rats. My deep gratitude to all of these beings for their contributions to the advancement of science. As a boundary condition, and I want to make it clear that I am restricting my inquiry at this time to conditions where the target in the form of film, metal, or whatever is in touch stroking physical contact with the skin of the perceptor and or activator. We have the lights down. Now for the basic question. What happens when the skin touches a surface? Obviously, many things, and we'll try to sort them out. This is a rather novel method of measuring skin potential, which will become more clear as we proceed. The measurements are done in a shielded room, and in the circuit as shown, with touch of the finger on the wire here, stationary. We get a charge, we get a potential which shows a range from minus 60 millivolts to plus 59.5 millivolts in skin DC potentials. And the measurements were done with respect to the RF source or the frequency range from 600 hertz to 4 megahertz. Now, the variation, as you can see, is wide both in sign and in magnitude from individual to individual. However, this control reading is done without the RF field being turned on. When the RF field is turned on, all subjects show plus 200 millivolt DC potential. When the stationary finger now begins to move in a violin bowing type of pressure and motion stroking, all subjects show the same sign and magnitude of DC potential, mainly starting from plus 200 millivolts going up to 250 millivolts. As we will show later, this stabilization of potential is due to a p-n junction effect. If we now add audio information to the carrier in the form of pure tone, speech, or music by means of amplitude modulation, stroking the wire induces normal hearing linear to the audio source when the wire is on any part of the head or neck. It was found by means of a box amplifier that the wire vibrates linear to the audio input. And by listening with a stethoscope, the skin also vibrates linearly to the audio input. The fidelity of this audio vibration is based on a high-order resolution electron phonon mechanism. Now, if we substitute a diode, and we'll show this as a diode, for the wire, this eliminates the need for stroking. That is, you can only get hearing when you stroke the wire in the amplitude modulated RF field. And so by mere substitution, we can show, and there are other experiments to support this, that the skin in movement actually looks like an NP junction. Thus, in this very simple experiment, we have found three major effects in a phenomenon of hearing amplitude modulated RF during skin stroking of a wire. We can now present a working hypothesis. With respect to charge, skin stroking induces a stable positive space charge between the skin-metal interface. The phonons, skin stroking friction produces audio pulses in the ELF range. By ELF, I mean somewhere between 5 or 6 or 8 hertz up to about 500 hertz, which sets up a mechanism for an NP junction. Third, we get detection which causes half-wave rectification of the carrier, and I'll show you a diagram of that, and audio frequency range vibrations in the metal and in the skin. Later, we will look in more detail at these three mechanisms. We now started a systematic investigation of the touch stroking phenomenon using the AM RF signal exactly as one would carry out alternating current spectroscopy of tissues. After I had become convinced that paranormal information acquisition was possible by means of skin touch stroking. Now here's the general test setup that we designed. We have here various generators. This is a carrier generator. We have the carrier generator here. We have various audio frequency inputs here. We have an amplitude modulation circuit in here. And then of course we have a power amplifier here. And the output is to a transformer with isolation, although this doesn't show it, it normally is center tap. And then we have a series LC inductance capacitive resonance circuit so that across the tissues we're always in series resonance. And then we have various monitoring systems. Now, in more detail, looking at the skin, particularly the head, if this then represents now the generator, what we have here is the equivalent circuit of the tissue here, and of course here we have the plate capacitor couplers, and here we have the inductance, and the whole thing looks like a second order polynomial filter. Now, case 1 electrodes here means that we use round, flat, stainless steel discs coupled directly to the skin without any gel coupling between the metal and the skin. And if it is a stationary electrode, we label it case 1A, and if it's stroked, we call it case 1B. Now here is the basic signal monitoring setup that we use, which I think all of you would be familiar with. Not shown in this diagram is an AC impedance bridge and an RF spectrum power analyzer with a range from DC up to 10 gigahertz. Acoustic waves, that is phonons, are monitored in the tissue either by stethoscope or for special purposes with a microphone and looking at the traces on an oscilloscope. Now here we show in A the waveform of an amplitude modulated RF output, which is also across the head as case 1A, that is stationary. In B, we have an amplitude modulated RF signal which is rectified by being stroked across the tissues. And the important point to bring to your attention is that no matter what frequency you use, whether it's carrier or audio, you always get clipping of the positive half of the wave, which is an important part of the PN junction effect, which I will later go into again in more detail down to a molecular level. And in C, we see partial half-wave rectification or clipping when one electrode is bare metal on the skin and another electrode is covered with a film of mylar, which is a good dielectric for this type of signal. And this we call case 3 electrodes. Now looking at, this is a time representation of the signal. If we look at it in cross-section, we have here the center carrier frequency, and here we have both the upper and lower sidebands of the audio signal, which in this case happens to be 1 kilohertz. Now, we were interested, of course, in the impedance function of the tissues, and here's a graph which shows total impedance Z across the forearm as a function of frequency with 5 different types of electrodes. Number 4 in the chart is what the impedance curve looks like with respect to frequency, and as you can tell, this is up to 10 to the 6 hertz. And when we use flat discs of stainless steel electrodes, or case 1A. I might add, because you'll see this later, that for hearing in totally deaf people, by totally deaf I mean people who've been born deaf and usually without a cochlear apparatus or some central integrator in the auditory cortex is missing, the optimum frequency for hearing in those people is between about 4.4 and 6.4 hertz, which is somewhere about in here. But there's nothing special in this impedance chart to indicate that. That we found out empirically. Now here, just very briefly, you can see the difference in impedance between dielectric-coated electrodes, which is this slope here, and here's a unity slope, total impedance here, the carrier frequency, we're up to 10 to the 7th hertz in this plot. And here we have bare metal electrodes coupled directly to the skin. So you have quite a significant difference in the impedance function here. These electrodes are very useful for high voltage studies, which I will get into later. And these are very useful for hearing and for measuring the impedance of the tissue. In figure 2, I think you can see very quickly there are about 2 orders of magnitudes difference in power between stationary electrodes on the skin and stroked electrodes, where the criterion is whether a person can hear pure tone, so-called pure tone, at the threshold of hearing. And again, there's a significant difference when you, in the stimulus power required to get threshold of hearing, and these are normal hearing humans here. Now we found in our studies that it was highly advantageous to always get this kind of data that is parallel subjective data, that is the report of a human being that they're hearing, or the objective data while they're hearing as to various components of the impedance function. Now, in order to understand why stroked electrodes required less power for threshold hearing, hearing excitation, and for heightened paranormal information acquisition, we devised equivalent circuits for the two conditions. And I'll just go through this very rapidly. This is the test setup used. We have a voltage drop across the resistor. We have the human subject here. We have square wave pulses going in, and we're monitoring simultaneously both current and voltage waveforms. And in this diagram, we see what the equivalent, this is the spare, mind you, a square wave is coming in, and this is the deformation, or the so-called RC decay curve of the square wave. This is the voltage signal here, and this is the current signal here. And then to further amplify that effect, we show on top here the skin RC decay curves, again voltage on top, current on the bottom. And on the bottom we show the curves, RC decay curves, when we synthesize the equivalent circuit. Now the important, I'm going to show you the synthesized equivalent circuit so you get an idea what the skin looks like to an electrical signal. In general, in this diagram, this is case 1A, bare metal electrode stationary. This term of the arm is the actual impedance of the tissue. When we say tissue, that means the skin, the underlying subcutaneous tissues, which includes a lot of things, and blood vessels, sweat glands, and so on. And this is lumped together. This term on this side usually represents, in most cases, the effect of the contact potential. And you can see that rather dramatically, because here where you have the same conditions, you stroke the electrode, you get a number of things. First, an NP junction effect occurs, which we represent with a diode here. The resistance of the skin goes down from 4,700 ohms down to 350 ohms. And likewise, on this side, the impedance term, as far as resistance is variable, goes up to about 100 kilo ohms, and the capacitance here drops from 0.2 of a microfarad to a rather small value. And these are other equivalent circuits that we developed to see what the skin looks like as far as its response to an electrical signal. Now, in this model, we've synthesized the equivalent circuit for the wire stroking phenomena shown at the beginning. Note that in the addition to the equivalent circuit of figure 31, just described, we add an LC series inductance, series element right here, where the crystal is shown, to include the photon function, and a diode on the top to include the detection function. So we have here the equivalent circuit of the tissue. It's been reversed from the previous diagram. And here we have an LC element, which we can, in this case it was a PZT crystal, and here we have a diode, and now one can hear very well, very clear, without any stroking. So we have replaced all the elements of the skin stroking phenomena with a very few simple circuit elements, which to any old radio amateur here looks like the old crystal detector radio set. Now, the series LC element, the crystal here, actually looks like a current pulse generator. when you analyze it. And it was found that the encoding of these current pulses, both in time, that is at the sequence in which they appeared on a time base, and pulse height, were responsible for hearing stimulation, both in normals and in the nerve depth. But this encoding is a separate problem which we will not pursue further here. This pulse effect, now we look at a power spectrum of the signal when a person is being tested. In this case, we have a totally deaf subject who'd never heard before, who was trained to hear. And we see what happens when we do a power spectrum analysis of the signal going through the tissues and into the head. Now, the pulse effect I just described with current is illustrated in this power spectrum distribution analysis during high-quality speech-hearing perception in nerve-deaf patients. Stroking increases speech-hearing discrimination by distributing the sideband current pulses in the stationary harmonics as seen in C. See, this is the detuned resonance. Resonance is at the peak here, and it's detuned to the high side of resonance. It's a very important part of the phenomena. But the breakup in the stationary sideband is a rather interesting finding, and we'll develop that again in a deeper sense later. We also found in the course of these studies that there were hysteresis loops present at the resonance center frequency at which hearing discrimination was optimal. And this is the test setup we use. We have an oscilloscope with XY plates shown as P and E here, and we have one lead into the inside the oral cavity, so we're really looking across the tissues, and here we have the stimulus as before. And we get a rather interesting spectral distribution here, which I will try to explain very quickly and briefly. We have here a center frequency for hearing in this particular configuration at 17 kilohertz, and slightly detuned from 17 kilohertz, that is on the high side, we see our classical hysteresis loop here. And then all the other loops are shown with test sampling at various frequencies. And when you get a hysteresis loop, you get hearing, which to all of you physicists means some kind of a dipole mechanism. And in this particular case, it meant a magnetic dipole mechanism. Now, when we have an interesting development here. When the bare electrode is stroked, and this is the stationary electrode, and this is the stroked electrode, we have a 102-degree phase shift from here to here with each stroke. Now the lines around the hysteresis loop are actually, for those of you who are electronic experts, are the stationary harmonic sidebands which we saw in the power spectrum earlier. So stroking not only induces, as we've already seen, a number of mechanisms, but induces a very specific kind of dipole mechanism that also has stationary sidebands. It's a very important effect. Thus we have clear evidence for a magnetic component of skin stroking as we observe this magnetic dipole rotation in the hysteresis loops. The search now tried to identify the unit particles responsible for the hysteresis loops as a sign of magnetic dipole rotation. Now, since these particles could be as large as biological cells, or membranes, or molecules, or atoms, or protons, or electrons, we faced a big task ahead of us. I might add about a 10-year task. For a number of reasons, we chose to study cells, red blood cells, suspended in a physiological solution, Ringer solution, because we could observe the cells for a long time through a microscope, as well as continue with our classical alternating current spectroscopy. And what we find is the following. This is a looking down through a microscope in a small microchamber at the red blood cells suspended in a Ringer solution, and this is a side view of the same thing. Now what we observe is the following. When there's no amplitude modulated RF signal applied, in this particular case, it was 4.5 kilohertz was the carrier frequency. The current was 1 milliamp, and the voltage was, RMS voltage was 1 volt. We observed the following. First, the cells do not clump, settle, or stick to walls. Secondly, there's a microorganization of the cells in this field into a dynamic toroid. These cells rotate, as you see here by the arrows, and looking from above, this would look like a donut, and there would be absolutely no cells near the walls, either on the bottom top or the sides. The important thing is that the red blood cells are repelled from each other and from the walls of the cell. Now, when there's a cutoff of the amplitude modulated RF signal, there's a collapse of surface charge, and the cells begin to stick to the walls. One is reminded here of the stick, for those of you who are familiar with dowsing or radionics, of stroking. That is when you get the information signal coming through. Now, a long series of studies established that the cellulose nitrate walls developed a minus 0.5 of a volt DC potential, and each red blood cell developed a surface charge of minus 0.05 volts up to 0.1 volt or 100 millivolts, depending on the experimental conditions. In effect, the like charges, minus and sign, cause repulsive forces between each cell and between the cells and the walls. Now, I'll show you this quickly. When the chamber is not circular, but is a longitudinal cylinder, one sees what are called pearl chain effect. That is, these are polystyrene spheres, but you can get the same thing with red blood cells. They form into long chains like this, and well, aptly stated, it's called the pearl chain effect. This was loaned to me by Dr. Heller of the New England Institute of Medical Research. Now, it now remained to find out if this charge repulsion effect was truly physiological, that is something that we would normally expect to find in the skin. So we built an artificial heart chamber for a lot of complicated reasons of aluminum, as you see here, and energized by our circuit there, lined with Teflon. This kind of took the place of the mylar used previously. Now, when this artificial heart chamber was implanted in dogs, we found that blood clotting could be completely prevented without the use of anticoagulants. Whenever you run an artificial heart or put a person on a heart-lung machine, you always have to heparinize their blood to keep it from coagulating. Blood clotting is one of the biggest problems in all physiological manipulation of blood in artificial organs. Now, here, just to clarify what we're looking at, this is the inside of the heart chamber here. These are heart valves, and this is the pumping diaphragm. So we have a control run here in which no anticoagulant was used, no electrical charge, and in 22 minutes had solid clots here, and if you look carefully you see that fibrin, blood clots, have formed on both valves. Here we have a run in which we had an AMRF field across all the blood pumped through the dog, and this particular run was 14 hours of pumping, and you see absolutely clean valves here, and you see no blood coagulation on the pumping diaphragm. So this is a basic finding in the mechanism of blood clotting in health. And for those of you who know a little bit about negative ions, when you breathe negative ions, it's exactly what happens physiologically. Each blood cell in your bloodstream, including the protein serum, will get charged with a negative charge. And for those of you who are into yoga, this is what yogic breathing and prana does for your bloodstream. Each blood cell is charged so they don't bump into each other, and you have a continual Brownian motion type of repulsion, all of which you can watch under a microscope. What we were concerned about was whether all this was really physiological, because there's a lot of intervention involved here in the normal physiology of an animal. So what we did, just to clarify the whole picture, we ran very quickly. This is the control run with a pressure tracings. It's not important, carotid artery, left ventricle, and so on. And this is the artificial heart. And of course we have no heart, so we don't have a EKG here. But essentially we get the same kind of cardiovascular dynamics in both instances. So we felt, and we presented this material for the American Heart Association and had National Heart-Lung Institute grants and so on for this work. We figured this pretty well established that this is a natural phenomena that we were duplicating. And this finding has been observed, confirmed by others since we did the original work in the 60s. However, going through all this cellular work did not explain our hysteresis loop problem, which is what we started out to investigate. So we turned to studying what was happening to the weak electrolytes, namely the water, between the cells. And the water that was used as a physiological Ringer solution is about the molar concentration and consistency of sweat. Now, because the skin surface has a positive sign charge, very important to remember that. That's the P in the diode, PN diode. And cells under the skin surface are negative in charge, which we just kind of demonstrated with the red blood cell effect. We know that a potential gradient exists. And if there is a sharp discontinuity across this gradient, such as that from a membrane, we have the makings of a true classical PN junction. That is the diode that brings about the detection which we noted earlier. Now, in fact, such a discontinuity exists 1/10 of a millimeter below the skin surface at the boundary of the epidermis and the dermis. And this sets up not only the physical basis for a PN junction, we've accounted for all the elements, but it also sets up the physical basis for an energy gap, of which we'll speak about later with respect to superconductivity. But the answer lay elsewhere. That is, with respect to the hysteresis loops. One day I was watching the dancing of red blood cells under a microscope to the tune of varying electrical fields when I observed microbubbles coming from a pair of wire stainless steel electrodes. I thought to myself, this must surely be some dissolved gases in the fluid, such as CO2 or O2. But I had a gas analysis run. There was no CO2, only traces of O2 and enough hydrogen to suspect alternating current electrolysis, which was in fact unknown with respect to efficiency. I found that the gas bubble production had a reversible threshold at 4/10. Let's show this. Let's read it. Had a reversible threshold for electrolysis at 4/10 of a volt RMS and 4/10 of a milliamp RMS. which is equal to 0.16 milliwatts RMS. This proved in later studies to be the absolute reversible threshold for alternating current water electrolysis. I then remembered from earlier studies that we had found the absolute threshold for human hearing at 1 kilohertz when an amplitude modulated RF stimulus was used, that is with stroked electrodes, also at 0.16 milliwatts RMS. And looking at the data, this is the column BG here, and we see here at 0.16 that the power in the electrode entrance system in milliwatts, and all these others are part of the calculations going on. But what's interesting is this data point right here, where you read 0.0002 dynes per square centimeter of electrical pressure from this signal. This is where we get now more deeply into the phonon mechanism than we did before. Now, I just want to emphasize, I don't want to go into the mathematics of how all this was calculated. It's not really relevant. Anybody's interested, I can show them all the equations and how we arrived at these conclusions. But the important thing is the following, that for hearing in normals, we found the absolute threshold for hearing 1 kilohertz, that is 1,000 cycles, acoustically at 0.0002 dynes per centimeter squared, and electrically, we found that we had the same pressure of 0.0002 dynes per square centimeter, all at a power level of 0.16 milliwatts, or for those of you who are used to the IS system, this is equivalent to 5 times 10 to the minus 9 newtons. And parallel to this finding, using the same electrical signal, we found that the absolute reversible threshold of electrolysis for water, that is with saline in it, was at the same power levels and the same pressure levels. Now, as I say, I don't really want to take the time to review the mathematical foundations of this pressure effect, but it's rather straightforward and other people have done the same thing. So you have to bear with me and accept that one pretty much on faith. Now, we did further calculations which again are more pertinent to the stroking phenomena, and that we found by calculation that the displacement amplitude, that is how high up and down the tissues were vibrating during this phenomena, at 1 kilohertz at the absolute threshold is 1.10 times 10 to the minus 11th centimeters, an extremely small amplitude of vibration. Or for those of you who are interested in the IS system, this is 1.10 times 10 to the minus 13th meter. Now, since we know that the Compton wavelength of the electron is 3.8 times 10 to the minus 13 meter, or 2 orders of magnitude greater than the diameter of an electron, we began to assume that our AC spectroscopy with respect to the hysteresis loop was really looking at the electron. And we'll get into this again in deeper detail. The question was not whether it was now the electron or not, but in what structure, molecule, membrane, or atom are these electrons that are responsible for the hysteresis loop. Now, further studies established, there's a whole field in itself which I'm going to skip over in about a paragraph, that the absolute reversible threshold of AC electrolysis occurred at a molar concentration of the electrolytes, potassium, calcium, and magnesium, which are in the skin and in the blood and in the tissues, equivalent to that in the body fluids, like sweat at the surface, of 0.9% concentration, or in molar terms, 0.15 moles. And that the absolute resonant frequency lay somewhere between 4 to 6 kilohertz. Now this resonant frequency coincided with impedance and admittance measurements across the head and across a water sample, and we're only showing the chart from across the head where the same crossover effect is found. It's right in this area where the R, X, G, and B curves cross. This is impedance, this is admittance, and this is 4.4 to 6.4 kilohertz. Now, the three effects, reversible threshold of electrolysis, molar concentration, and frequency dependence are very dependent on the doping of water by electrolytes. Thus, the data from hysteresis curves, water electrolysis, amplitude displacement of tissues, and impedance functions all pointed to the possibility that the electrons we were pursuing were attached to water molecules. So I resumed the study of the water molecule, which I will henceforth in this talk call the hydron, H-Y-D-R-O-N, from the Greek word for water. In working at the low power levels of the reversible threshold of alternating current electrolysis, I found another interesting effect. When I cut the amplitude modulated RF power to the electrolysis cell and monitored the water directly, as the electrodes were in the water, the oscilloscope revealed positive unipolar pulses, 0.6 of a volt peak to peak, being emitted from the water at approximately 5 kilohertz in this region here. Although the transdermal oscillator was still oscillating, there was no detectable current flowing from it to the cell. That is, I had a pure open circuit condition by means of a switch. The voltage pulses, surprisingly, mimicked the nerve action potential spike. And I know all you neurophysiologists are going to freak out at that statement. It turned out that the critical factor producing such open circuit unipolar resonant pulses was that I had designed the transdermal automatic RF oscillator in such a way that it automatically cycled the percentage of amplitude from 0 to 90% and back to 0% over a variable tau cycle, a time cycle, which I'll just call tau. Now, when tau was adjusted to the nuclear magnetic resonance tau of the proton in water, which is approximately 3 seconds depending on the concentration, or 0.36 hertz, the so-called unipolar action potential pulses out of water, no nerves are around, occurred. I need not describe my feelings when I realized that I may have stumbled upon the genesis of the nervous system action potential. Those familiar, and I know one person in this audience is, familiar with the McCullough theory of nervous function being based on water crystals, which exist at body temperature, and the Linus-Pauling theory of anesthesia being based on water clatrate structures for certain anesthetic agents, also at body temperature, will appreciate my feelings with this discovery. Now we get down to the serious part of this talk. Here we have a schematic of the water molecule, the hydron, which is enclosed within this cubical structure only as a frame. The actual water molecule is at the 4 vertices. The components are at the 4 vertices of the tetrahedron, and the center of mass is here, the oxygen. Now, water is known to exist in a tetrahedral form with a 109-degree, 28-minute angle. There's another angle of 104 degrees, but it turns out in our studies that if you start out with a 104-degree angle in the tetrahedron in water and pump up the energy, it goes up to 109 degrees, 28 minutes. Now, we can localize the mechanism of hydrogen resonating bond angle of 109 degrees, 29 minutes, where and I'll have to try to point this out to you. L1 here and L2 are the lone pair electrons existing here and here. And the hydrogen, as a bare strip proton, exists at H1 and H2 here. So you have a rather unique circuit in which, if you look at it carefully, this angle, this vector line here is orthonormal to the vector line. See, I've got to get this straightened out now. Over here, because this straighten out now. Over here, because this vector is like this, and then I'm sorry, these two vectors are like three vectors are like this. But I'll get it straightened out with respect to the orthonormality later. Now, what's important in this structure, and this is not my structure, this is taken right out of classical textbooks on water. What's important is that the oxygen atom in the center controls the relationship between the lone pair electrons and the proton. We can think of the lone pair electrons operating under certain conditions, like the so-called Cooper electron pairs found in superconductivity. Just file that in the back of your heads, those of you who are interested in superconductivity at room temperature. Now, just to relate this model of the water molecule to the electronic spectroscopy we've been doing, I want to briefly show you that we can very clearly theorize this here are the chains of keratin. All tissues, feathers, nails, skin, hair, all contain keratin as the fundamental protein. And the chains in the alpha helix configuration are linked by this NHO bond, or COHN, reading it that way. And if you want to understand where the PN junction is in there, you have here a semiconductor. You have the barrier layer here between the hydrogen and the oxygen. You can find the equivalent effect in the water molecule. And you have a nice semiconductor. And to get back now to the model relating the water to the molecular tissue organization, we can actually make an equivalent circuit which very quickly, I'll show that to you in respect to the water molecule. If this is the plasma membrane, we have a dielectric function across it, which we term here because of our AC spectroscopy, ferroelectric capacitor, which has rather unique properties. And here we have a classical EMF source. Across the nerve membrane, which is measured by every neurophysiologist. Now, the equivalent circuit then becomes a capacitor, a diode, and a source of EMF. And a lot more that could be said about that, but I present that very briefly. I'll now try to relate this equivalent circuit of the skin, the nerve, and at the molecular level, particularly keratin at the surface, to the water molecule. Now I will just explain. This is the equivalent circuit. This is the water molecule in tetrahedral form, and these components, where the arrows are, relate like the lone pair electrons here to part of the EMF circuit, and so likewise here the hydrogen is the active component that makes up the ferroelectric capacitor function across the nerve. And for those of you who are neurophysiologists, you know that essentially the so-called water of hydration is around the membrane. We're not talking about the little pads through the membrane. We're talking about the water around the membrane. Now, just have to get back to my notes here. Okay. Here, I'll try to follow my script and the drawing at the same time. Here, the oxygen atom is the center of mass for both the voltage and the capacitor function, where the electron pairs here and here relate in resonance. And those of you who know hydrogen bond resonance know what I mean, between the lone pair and the electron and the hydrogen or the proton out at the other vertex. And one pair of E to H1 gives you the capacitance function, which you can trace here, and the other gives you the voltage function. Now each axis of these pairs are rotated orthogonally and are dynamically 180 degrees out of phase, and again all controlled by the center of mass of the oxygen atom. Now, due to a peculiarity of the hydrogen atom, which those of you who are familiar with gas chromatography, we know that in gas chromatography from thermal conductivity detection that you get very peculiar behavior of the hydrogen atom. Sometimes it positively is a heat emitter, and other times it's a heat sink, it's a negative heat source. So this gives you a lot of problem when you're doing gas chromatography looking specifically at hydrogen. And this property, though, is what gives rise to a thermal cycling in the ferroelectric capacitor, so that as the current flows, charges up the capacitor, and the capacitor discharges into the load, it produces an AC signal, and the thermal cycling then reverses the charge here, and you get charge flowing in and the cycle reverses. So starting with a DC system and a diode, you have an AC output. And that's the essence of this particular. Okay, I've got to go fast, I see, so I will just blur through the rest of these rather quickly. Now we've now accounted for the role of the electron and the proton in the skin through in the skin touch stroke phenomena. We have not yet accounted for the photon. I had observed in the dark, with the dark adapted eye, it takes about 15 minutes for the eye to really get adapted to the dark, that at higher power levels of transdermal stimulation across the skin, a bluish-white corona radiation appeared between the electrode and the skin. The threshold for this effect was 10 milliamps RMS at 150 volts peak to peak, or 86 milliwatts. Now here you see the power spectrum when the two electrodes are held face to face, and here you see the power spectrum across the skin when the skin is stroked, and there's a gain between these two of about 10 dB, which is quite significant. We are looking in this power spectrum I just showed you at the classical Kirlian effect. I must say I never heard of the Kirlian effect in 1961, and I just accidentally discovered it, but a lot of other people did too, so it doesn't mean very much. Later on I found out they had a word for it. But what was different was that the broadband radiation was radiating in a continuous spectrum from the human body from 50 kilohertz to 10 gigahertz, which was the limit of our detection equipment. Because of the bluish-white corona radiation presence, I am sure that the electromagnetic spectrum extended continuously from 10 gigahertz up to the visible, if not to the near ultraviolet region, but I did not have the equipment to explore that region. What we are looking at in that particular power spectrum analysis is a Fourier transform interferometry amplification occurring between the electrode and the skin. Essentially, in simple language, sparks jump across from the plate to the skin, and they contain all frequencies. Somehow the skin sorts them all out, and you have a beautiful Fourier transform interferometer spectroscope, very cheap. Now, the interesting thing about this broadband radiation in the human body with this effect was that hearing was not distorted, and yet every frequency that you tuned in on across this enormous band of radiation with tuned RF detectors also carried the original modulated signal. So it's a very unique effect. Now, this put me onto the trail of the photons, but I was at a loss for some time as to how to proceed to unravel this photon problem until I read Philip Callahan's work. He's an entomologist down at the University of Florida at Gainesville on the pheromone, which means the external hormone of insects. What he discovered can be summarized. His principal measuring tool was a Fourier transform interferometer spectroscope. And his basic findings were: one, the insects rub their legs or vibrate their antenna within an ELF frequency range to develop an electrical charge. Two, if an insect hormone and water vapor are placed on a wax electrode and rubbed with silk to develop charge, the result is radiation of coherent, very narrow band infrared radiation, which we see on this chart. Three, an insect can be attracted just as powerfully with the artificially induced coherent radiation line of the pheromone, as in my statement above, as it is by the natural effect of the pheromone IR emission. And here very briefly you can see the coherent lines up here radiating. Here you see a very much more narrow band coherent radiation. And I think I skipped I lost one drawing that showed, here it is. This shows real narrowband radiation from the pheromone-doped water vapor. Without water vapor, the effect did not occur. Now, Callahan concluded that insects communicate, at least for sex signals, by the following means. First, the insect pheromone released by the female dopes water vapor. Two, doped water vapor must be energized with infrared from the environment. Night sky is a good source of this. Three, for perception of this signal at a distance, the male uses ELF vibration and cuticle charge induction. The cuticle of an insect is also made of keratin, just like our skin is, to sensitize the receptors and to receive the very narrow band coherent infrared signal. Now, this type of work has been extended and generalized by Bernhard Ruth in West Germany, Fritz Albert Popp, and others, who have shown that coherent photonic radiation from far infrared through the ultraviolet is widespread in biological nature, and with few exceptions is found in all living things, from the lowest bacteria to man. We now have most of the pieces of the experimental puzzle of touch stroking, information action phenomena. What is needed is a theory to glue smoothly the pieces together. Fortunately, to pave the way, we have the theories of the Iceland Research Group, Rauscher, Madigan, Walker, Hasted, Costa de Beauregard, and more cogently, the recent theories of Tom Bearden. And I'm grateful to all of them for helping me understand all these phenomena. Now, Tom Bearden has come up with a generalization, which he calls the Eureka concept, and I use this with his permission. And I will, very briefly, differentiating the Maxwellian equations, yields things like carrier modulation. Conceptually, the signal looks like this. Actually, the power spectrum looks like this. The electromagnetic wave is fed by these little arrows, which we call virtual photons. And here you have hyperspatial components into and out of the photon. and those of you interested can read the book and get all the detail. But we can now put all the pieces together. First, we have a phonon mechanism. Stroking builds up a polarized charge between the skin and sample interface and triggers phonon vibration at discrete intervals, as we saw in the harmonics, in the ELF, AF, audio frequency, radio frequency, and infrared to ultraviolet bands as harmonics. There's a mathematical formula describes this harmonic frequency, but intervals, but I don't want to go into that now. The hydron, the unit tetrahedral hydron, and the infinite numbers of geometries arising from doped clatrates is the unit electrical circuit to handle the electron phonon wave. On the skin surface, the sweat glands furnish the weak electrolyte at the correct molal concentration. The critical dopant comes, in the case of psychometry, from the sample, that is the photo, the metal, etc., being stroked. Amplification, the extremely low frequency nuclear magnetic rotation of the magnetic moment of the proton modulates the center of mass oxygen in the hydron, which in turn controls the frequency or modulates the frequency of the hydrogen bonding that is between the lone pairs and the stripped hydrogen, the proton. And the resonance, and it's known from bending in water studies that this bond in water vapor emits infrared radiation in well-known bands, which we can specify, and with an energy release in the range from, within physiological range, from 1/10 of an electron volt to 1 electron volt. This, in my opinion, is the amplification process. Stimulation. The actual mechanism of coherent photon emission is linked to the stimulation process cited, but is more dependent on the detection mechanism between the oxygen and the hydrogen atoms, which produces unipolar DC pulses, and I suspect initiates an hydrogen bond breaking mechanism invoking all 9 degrees of freedom known in the hydron. That is 2 for stretching vibrations, 1 bending vibration, 3 rotation vibrations, and 3 translational vibrations, giving 9 degrees of freedom. They give rise to a range of known photonic emissions from far, far infrared, that is about 200 per centimeter, to near infrared, 55.5 per centimeter, through the visible and into the ultraviolet spectrum. Now, emission. The dopant molecule in the hydron complex is critical in obtaining the precise, coherent photon radiation that carries the information. The dopant can come from the skin, from a film surface, positive or negative film, or from a metal sample. As we saw in Callahan's work, the dopant triggers the fundamental information of life itself, operating at the DNA level of molecular organization. This fact alone gives us a hint of what is possible in diagnosis and treatment from laying on of hands and radionics. That a healer can quote charge unquote water, which in turn can be used for treatment, is well established from the classical work of Bernie Grad and Justice Smith. The ferroelectric circuit already described in its thermal cycling due to the hydrogen proton covers this effect. Here we can add that the ferroelectric capacitor sandwich made up of the paired electrons and the hydrogen proton coupling probably clamps only the vacuum zero-point energy phase of space. As we know, it requires an energy gap of only 3 angstrom units, about 3 times 10 to the minus 8 centimeters, between the lone pair electrons and hydrogen in resonance at the apices of the hydron tetrahedron to satisfy superconductivity requirements, in addition to the paired electrons we have already mentioned. Now, if this proves to be so, we may be looking at a biological Josephson junction, with a DC potential across the electrons and proton of the order of 1.236 electron volts, generates a center frequency of the Josephson AC superconducting radiation at a wavelength of 1 micrometer, or a frequency of approximately 4.835 times 10 to the 14th hertz, right on the boundary between infrared and visible photons. Radiation, the last part. From basic physical theory and from Bearden's theory, we see that photonic modulation of any form is always coupled to virtual photonic modulation. Thus, all normal sensory photonic activity has its virtual counterpart. This can also be thought of as a description of the human aura, seen by some and not by others. But in order to get paranormal information from touch stroking, one has to excite the coherent form of the photonic radiation, which in turn makes virtual photonic radiation accessible to the brain, nervous system, plasma membrane, hadrons specifically, as information per se. However, in order to get coherence of both the positive time photons and positive time virtual photons, one has to exercise the personal will to focus the intent. In the case of metal bending, one has to focus the intent to invoke the negative time photons and the negative time virtual photons. And as Bearden teaches us, these will cause a collapse of the state vector for electron charge, leaving behind a neutrino which leaves no thermodynamic trace, as all metal bending researchers have found to date. Thus, both hyperperception and hyperaction become understandable in the context of hyperspatial physics. Now, just so that you can have a peg in which to hang all these facts and theories, and I apologize for this in advance, I've coined an acronym which is phaser theory. P stands for phonon, H for hydron, A for amplification, S for stimulation, E for emission, R for radiation. But I wish to remind you that even if these intent-induced negative time virtual photons are the carriers of information per se and hyperspace action per se through the touch stroking process, these phenomena have more complexities in store before we can understand them. Here is a diagram of the ear from the acupuncture point of view. Now, consider that each square millimeter of this ear skin surface is a distinct set of sharply tuned circuits for a specialized domain of the body. And within each tuned circuit, there are possibly thousands of doped, complex clathrate hydrates with millions of coherent photonic channels available. Thus, we have something like 10 to the third plus 10 to the sixth, which yields something like 10 to the ninth channels per square millimeter skin available for both spatial and hyperspatial information and action processing. Now I'll skip some parts here which show how you apply this practically in ESP and all that. And I would like, in closing, to add one footnote. Modern quantum physics, while espousing the role of virtual photons, both in negative and positive time, tells us that it is not possible, even in principle, to observe or detect virtual photons. It would be an important advance for future research if we could prove that the process of metal bending as defined is indeed a detector for virtual photon physics. Thank you very much.
Well, we have a few minutes of questions. It'd be nice if you would give your name when you ask the question. Are there any questions? Dr. Rausch?
Yeah. I was interested in what you said about the skin acting as an interferometer microscope before you analyze it.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking about these experiments that purported to occur in Russia, where the person seems to be able to read with their hands blind to their direct visual perception, then it seems to me that you'd have to invoke some kind of model like this in order to be able to explain.
Yeah, this would completely explain dermal optic perception as long as you use the right touch pressure of stroking. And as you know, there's a lot of RF radiation around, both man-made and natural. And if that isn't enough, I don't know whether you're aware of it, but if you tense your muscles, you radiate a broad band of RF from about microtremors about 8 hertz up to about 100,000 hertz. So you've got the RF signal there all the time. So it's a possible mechanism and somebody could work at it.
What about doing the experiment in which there is no, you're evoking a model of virtual photons so that you probably wouldn't have a problem with being, but we did experiments where we tried to have remote perception of targets that had no photons in them. In other words, if you have, say, spoon bending or something like that occurring in a dark where there are no real photons, it seems to affect the review
Yeah, I'm not sure. We'll have to discuss that. That's very deep. Yeah.
Douglas D.
I like very much the theory on stroking.
You might notice I made the caveat at the beginning. I'm restricting my inquiry to what I call stored information, either in the body or in the test object, the film or whatever. And I don't want to, I mean, it's a whole separate physics to get into. We can deal with it when there's physical contact. But when you talk about these, what the Germans call ultra-weak photonic radiations, you can't, I mean, you just can't very easily see how they can transmit any distance at all. They get stopped right away. And so that's where you have to invoke virtual processes, Elizabeth's hyperspatial complex geometry. But that's another, another subject. I really don't understand it yet, frankly, Doug.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, Dr. Miller, Atlanta. You've been able to substitute a diode circuit for stroking. Will this diode circuit work in a radionic instrument where you can eliminate?
Yes, I forgot to mention in my lecture that a lot of what I've done in this work explains a lot of classical effects. For example, anybody who knows the Hieronymus radionic detector knows that basically it has a source, a detector of just a copper rod that detects photons and somehow gets them to an RF circuit, and you have an RF circuit across a capacitor so that when you're rubbing the plate, you're actually getting RF energization. And for those of you who may not know it, he got that patent in 1949, so he's way ahead of us in that respect. Well, I've done, I don't want to go into all the details because many of you are familiar with it, but I've done a lot of work with using psychics for criminal investigation, murder, CIA, political things. I mean, you name it, I've been all over the globe with super psychics. And they all showed enormous increase of sensitivity if you just give them an RF energized plate to rub and put the sample, usually a photograph of a murdered person or whatever the target may be, weapons, maps, blah, blah, blah. And it always helps their sensitivity. The other thing that helps their sensitivity, which is not a part of this lecture, but it's important that all of you know it because I think I gave it once at a lecture at MIT some 25 years ago, and it's been lost somewhere. I don't know what happened to it. But basically, if you take a powerful strobe light, like an Edgerton strobe light, where you can absolutely control the pulse width and the interval between pulses and the pulse height, and if you let the human being look through shields like something opaque right into the strobe light and allow them to adjust the frequency, invariably they will lock the frequency of the pulsing to their alpha frequency by themselves, and they'll keep adjusting it. And all of psychics and normal people report the same thing. As you look into this powerful strobe light flashing at you, you suddenly see in the center of the field a cross. There's no cross there, but that's what occurs in the brain in integrating the signal. And then somehow the inner vision is sucked into the center of the cross, and And from there they escape the 4D world we live in, and you can send them anywhere in the world to do all kinds of amazing things. So there is a photonic method that has not to do with the skin or the ears, but with the eye driving the brain. That is the most powerful thing I've ever found to trigger really super clairvoyance. So, again, a photonic mechanism. Yes?
Craig Willis here. I remember seeing a rather interesting article in Scientific American back about a year and a half or 2 years ago that talked about the propagation of quantum correlations, which seem to go faster than the speed of light. I just wondered if you happen to know of any tie-in between that and this concept of virtual photons and so on.
We have some experts in the audience. I can point them out to you. Elizabeth has worked on the problem. Evan Harris Walker has worked on the problem. I don't know, maybe Skippy. There are a number of Fred Wolf has worked on the problem. There's a lot of thinking gone into that. You can talk to them individually.
Last question, yes.
Yes,
some years ago, I was measuring skin resistance in an attempt to see when proton photography first came, whether there was a correlation with what happens to the healer's image under the relaxed normal state. And I had this psychic healer, and I wanted to get a relaxed measurement first with just a simple electron voltmeter. And so I said, just relax first. I want to get a base number, and then I want you to do your thing and see how it differs. And she said, what number do you want? The needle was going back and forth, and of course I was in the megohm range, and it dropped to 0, and I just kept flipping down the things. She could create any kind of a skin resistance she wanted from 10 to the 6th down to 1 ohm.
That's pretty good.
Is that...
Yeah, because you see, I haven't gone into all the ramifications of this idea, but basically I think some of you picked up what is going on. When you have an intent to get intelligence, let's say from a picture, or you want to get a number on a meter, the sensitive people, Frank Fairley is a great operator, and I've learned a great deal from her. They start stroking, and they get what they call a stick. And that tells them yes or no, whatever their internal code is. That stick is actually caused by secretion of fluids from the skin. Now, it isn't just all sweat. There are sebaceous fluids and so on, but they all add up to a little gucky stuff. So, in the case of your subject with the resistance, she obviously had the ability to titrate, I mean, incredibly accurate to, like micromoles, the molar concentration of the tissue where you were measuring the sample. And any of you who have studied psychics in great depth know a number of other things. For example, Geller, this is not generally known, but I think it should be known. It's been 10 years since we exposed him to the world. When he works very hard in the laboratory, and they give him steel bars to bend and all kind of impossible stuff, or he does a huge audience of 5,000 and does a lot of things, repairs watches, bends metals, etc., etc. His body temperature goes down so low that, I mean, it would be scary if I gave you the numbers. And he has to get out of that hall as soon as possible. He used to drive me nuts when I drove with him, rush to his hotel room, pull all the blinds. He'd already ordered 6 huge, 1,000-watt heaters, pull blankets on him. He has to regenerate his body heat because he's dropped about 15 degrees centigrade in that performance. So this is one of the things that got me thinking, watching him, and I've seen other people like this, that some superconductivity effect is occurring in very narrow, discrete regions of space. I mean, if real superconductivity occurred, it would be, the magnetic effects and so on would be overwhelming. But that's a very important point. And the other thing that I think some of you have noticed in psychic research or poltergeist phenomena is the temperature of the room in seances starts going way down, and then of course when you get in touch with some entity, you can get them to run it up and down the scale. So thermal effects are extremely important in psychic phenomena, and again, not generally really considered as part of the stabilization of the psychic. To really use a psychic well, you got to have them in a sheet metal copper room. You have to have thermal control. You have to have the CO pressure in the room carefully regulated, because the PCO2 in the blood is extremely important in releasing these phenomena. For example, a colleague of mine in New York who does carbon dioxide therapy, 20% oxygen, 80% carbon dioxide. I don't know, how many of you have ever taken a whiff of carbogen? It's an overwhelming experience. You take 2 or 3 whiffs, and all the psychedelic lights go on in your brain and you pass out. It's very rapid. But the photon release with CO2, which is a normal physiological component, is enormous. But he found out that he could train people to bend metal like in 3 or 4 minutes just with the carbogen inhalation. So there's a lot of physiological mechanisms, thermal gas, molar concentrations, charge, all these things that I'm sorry to say parapsychologists in general don't look at. But they're very basic because you can manipulate a human being to an optimum state so they can really do great things. And in teaching, of course, this is important.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay.